Hello, Louis.
Hi to you.
Ready for the snow?
I am. I'm looking forward to it. Can't wait to get my snowblower out.
There are a few folks. I have a couple. I have a feeling this snow will have to make a few passes, not just one.
We're actually going to start about noon though, right?
I think so. Or a little after here.
Okay.
I see what the map shows. Yeah. It shows currently that the snow is still a little bit south of Des Moines. So.
Well, we're at 53 participants and probably climbing. And I think Karen will continue to admit people joining as we get going. But I know that we do have a full program today by our presenter, and we're excited to get started. So welcome to the January 25th meeting of the Rotary Club of Ames. And as always, if you are able and willing to please stand, we will virtually recite our Pledge of Allegiance with the flag on the screen. Feel free to join along. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And before we get started with our welcome with our current members and some visitors from other clubs, a couple people I'm aware of that we need to keep in our thoughts this week. I'm sure many of you had several conversations and got to know Bob Bishop over the years. Bob is our dining manager at the Gateway Hotel when we meet at the Gateway in person. And I know Karen sent out an email here yesterday, but we need to keep Bob and his family in our thoughts as his mother, Lynn Bishop, passed away after battling cancer for several months. So sad day, and I want to make sure that we know Bob, that we're thinking of him and his family. Also found out that former Rotarian and also former leader of our United Way of Story County, Frankie Olson, has unfortunately been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. We'll be starting chemo soon. Frankie has asked that she ask for no visitors, no calls or flowers, but just please send positive thoughts her way. So if we could all also keep her in our thoughts as well. So with that, is there anyone else that we should be thinking of in our Rotary family today? Let's just take a moment. All right, we have a full program today. It's exciting. We do have some folks from other clubs that are joining us today. So in true Rotary Club of Ames fashion, I'm going to ask John Christie of our music committee to unmute and to kick us off with the welcome song here. And hopefully John's on.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Chad.
Awesome. Yep.
To our guests and visitors, welcome to you from Ames Rotary, Nevada, London, Océ Paris, from far off lands or the USA. We're glad that you are here today. Come back again whenever you're near. Join us and then we'll make it clear. Around the world you will always be welcome at Rotary.
Thank you, John. As always, thank you and thank the music committee. A couple of announcements. You see the slide here on your screen. George Belitzos is leading the Rotary Action Group Against Slavery, so the fight against human trafficking, and they're having a virtual summit. As you can see, it is Wednesday, this Wednesday, the 27th, and it looks like 8 a.m. to 1:30 Central Time, 9 to 2:30 Eastern, and there's some registration information there. If you have problems with that, you could probably reach out to George or to Karen. But thank you, George, for all you do in the fight against human slavery. And one more announcement before we get started. Tuesday evening at 6 p.m., we actually, as a Rotary Club of Ames, are going to be announced. We're going to receive a proclamation from the mayor during the Ames City Council meeting. We're actually towards the beginning of the agenda, and the mayor will be reading a proclamation in observation of the Rotary Club of Ames 100th anniversary. And I think then March 1st, 2021 will be the Rotary Club of Ames Day. So we're excited. I know a few of us will be able to be there for that proclamation. Again, if you want to, I'm sure with the City of Ames City Council meeting channel, you'll be able to tune in and view that. It'll probably be fairly close to 6 p.m. on Tuesday. So that's exciting news for our club. And I think that's all I had for announcements. And then before I ask, I think Louis is going to properly introduce our speaker today. I'm just asking again, while we're doing that, if you have questions, feel free to put your questions and type them in the chat if you can. And then we can, if we can at the end, and we hopefully will have time to address those questions. That seems to be a very efficient way of doing that. So if you do have a chance, you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat. And then I'm also now going to ask Louis Bannett to unmute and then properly introduce our speaker for today. Take it away, Louis.
Very happy to introduce Dr. Fulton. He is originally from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, but his parents met here in Ames at Iowa State. His dad was born in Ames and his mom is from Marshalltown. Dan met his wife here at ISU, and she is from Eddyville, Iowa. They have 5 children, ages 12, 10, 5, and 7-month-old twins. Dr. Fulton graduated from Iowa State University, Minnesota, Iowa State University, and the University of Minnesota Medical School. And as a matter of fact, it's exactly 50 years after I graduated from the same medical school. And then he had his residency in internal medicine at Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis, which when I did it there was called Minneapolis General Hospital. Following an infectious disease fellowship at the University of Iowa, finishing in 2015, he joined McFarland Clinic in 2015. He was recognized by Mary Greeley Medical Center as the winner of Innovation and Excellence Award, Physician category in 2019. And just this past year, he received an award from the McFarland Clinic Trusted Choice Founders Award, which is given to an individual who demonstrates exceptional efforts in leadership and motivation, supporting the organizational goals of McFarland Clinic. So with that introduction, Dr. Fulton will give us some information about the COVID virus and the vaccine program. Dr. Fulton.
Thank you, sir, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here today and the opportunity to talk and share some things and, hopefully engage in some conversation at the end. I really appreciate all that you all do and the year that we've had, and just want to thank you for your part in all this. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here, and we'll jump right in. So the goal today is primarily to talk about the COVID-19 vaccination process as it's rolling out. And I think we're all hearing a lot about that. So I wanted to share some specifics about COVID vaccination, and then some of our local context here in Ames, both at Mary Greeley and McFarland Clinic. So we're going to try and start with just reviewing kind of the COVID numbers. That's what we think of with epidemiology, the overall numbers that we're seeing. Talk a little bit about what we're seeing with COVID right now and treatments. But really, I want to focus on what we know about the vaccine and what we're learning as we go. This year has been, I think, an incredible challenge for so many people. And I can't say enough about what our team at the hospital has done in terms of all the nurses, what our community has done in terms of working together to try and mitigate spread, whether that's the schools or creative business solutions, or just people making good choices. So thanks to everybody up front. So if we just talk a little bit about the numbers with COVID, these are graphs that people are pretty familiar with now. These are our daily case curves here in the United States. We've hit this peak kind of mid-December. We seem to be starting to drift down. Unfortunately, this is a disease that as people get it can often lead to death, and the death rates often will lag behind the total case rates. And so that's why you see that number still going up. That usually lags behind about 2 to 3 weeks before it starts to peak. But it's been a truly devastating disease, both in the United States and across the world. Here in Iowa, I would say that we had our hardest time in November, and that was reflected here at Mary Greeley as well. But you can see that we have not had a big sort of post-holiday bump that we worried about. And I think for me here in Ames, I'm wondering what these numbers will look like when the students come back to Iowa State. But I would also say that in general, the students have not gotten so ill. So I don't expect student numbers to lead to increased deaths unless there's more spread within the community. I wouldn't be surprised if we do get another bump here in Ames into February, but we're very hopeful that the vaccines are going to make a real big difference, especially in this bottom category, which has really been hard. And I always think it's important to remember when we talk about numbers that these numbers do not reflect the reality of, what it means to have a family member get COVID, die from COVID, or even survive COVID, but have, long-lasting complications from it. So the Des Moines Register has done a really nice series called Iowa Mourns about people and their stories. And I think those are so important to remember when we look at numbers like this, that these are all individual people with stories and families and people that care about them. And we just need to remember that I think we all have a lot to grieve about as we're going through this as well. When we think about COVID in general, this is a chart. This R value is, if an R value was 1, then one person would be expected to pass that infection on to one other person. So you can see that COVID here is felt to be more contagious than, say, influenza. So for every person that gets COVID, we generally see 2.5 more cases of spread. And we've obviously seen reports of what are called super spreader events where a lot of people get infected. But in general, COVID has not been as contagious as, say, something like measles. And I would add that we have a measles vaccine, and we are able to really completely control this infection through vaccination, which gives us a lot of hope about this infection. I also think it's important to talk about risk level when we think about what can we do to mitigate spread beyond the vaccine. And this is a chart actually from Texas Public Health, and up at the top you can see low risk activities working our way down to higher risk activities. And I do think that it's been hard to gauge for people who want to do the right thing, but sometimes it's a little bit hard to know what is a high risk activity and what is not. So I think in general, outdoor activities are much safer than indoor. Activities that you can do with the mask on are much safer than activities that you can't do with the mask on. And then the longer you're indoors in close proximity to someone, the higher the risk of transmission. So I'll let you read those kind of individual areas at your leisure. But knowing your own risk for getting a bad infection from COVID and using these risks, you can start to come up with some strategies to decrease the chance of infection. The way COVID works is our lungs are like big sponges full of air pockets, and air is supposed to go into those pockets and get exchanged into the blood, and then carbon dioxide comes out of the blood and gets sent out. So when viral particles get inhaled into the lungs, they start to invade these tissues. What then happens is the body says, well, wait a minute, we don't want that, and then sends an inflammation process into these tissues to fight back. And it seems like really two things are happening with COVID-19 that are making it so severe. One is that when COVID-19 comes in, it damages the part of the lung that is responsible for rebuilding damaged lung. So it makes it harder for damaged lung to recover once it's been damaged. And the other thing with COVID-19 that we were seeing is that something about this process is often generating an overabundant immune response, so that the inflammation of the body as it tries to fight this infection comes into these air sacs and just fills them up with fluid, making it very difficult for people to breathe. And sometimes even with support through oxygen or even a ventilator, we're not able to get enough oxygen into the bloodstream. That sort of leads to an illness that has two phases. One is that at the beginning, the virus is replicating in the lungs and people are contagious. But over time, it becomes less about the virus and more about the inflammation in the lungs. So as we target different strategies to fight against COVID, we think early on about antivirus treatments or antibody treatments. There are things called plasma or antibodies that are made in a lab. If you give those early enough, you can slow down this virus replication process. But once the cat is out of the bag with that, then you're really looking more at the inflammation process. And then that's where treatment with things like steroids has been shown to be helpful. I think the downside is that no treatment has been shown to be very helpful. They're all sort of mild benefit at best. So we have some different approaches we take depending on if somebody's in the clinic and not needing to be in the hospital. Depending on their risk, they may get some antibody infusions. If they're in the hospital, we have different therapies that we can give. But unfortunately, none of these has really turned out to be a reliable or surefire treatment. And some patients seem like they progress and get worse no matter what we do. So we do have more options now compared to before. There's been a ton of research going into different treatment options. But unfortunately, they're not very effective, probably because by the time we know somebody has this disease, the virus is already, really spread through the lung, and it's more about that inflammation process on the back end, which is why vaccination becomes such an important part of how we treat this disease. And we can talk more about the disease itself or treatments if you like at the end. But let's talk about vaccines. And before we talk about COVID, I'd like to talk about a different virus. So some of you may remember polio virus. Back in the 50s, it was actually pretty bad. A lot of kids were ending up with paralysis or even not surviving polio. Imagine 21,000 little kids ending up paralyzed in 1 year. There's a lot of fear, and there's all sorts of stories about families moving out of cities in the summer when this would spread, and really affected people. Polio was first discovered in 1905, and then over the course of the next 50 years, they learned more and more. And a few things to note is they did try plasma on this for a while, just like we're doing with COVID. There's also an episode in 1955, which was perhaps one of the worst vaccine incidents that we've seen when it comes to vaccines. This was an attempt to give people a dead version of this polio virus, but it turned out that they weren't processing it correctly, and a whole bunch of kids were given polio and got polio disease from this vaccine. So I think this incident led to a lot of what we see when it comes to vaccine, focuses on vaccine safety. But again, 50 years, we finally got to a point where a vaccine was licensed and available. And this photo I wanted to share because here in the middle of this photo, this is my dad. So he was born here in Ames. And here he is with 5 of his brothers. And this is when they got their first polio vaccine. And some of you may remember this when you were kids, going and getting these sugar cubes. And that's all my dad remembers about it, is that he'd never gotten a sugar cube before. My Uncle Chris here, seems like he's liking it. But this was a new thing, and it was a thing that nobody knew for sure it would work. There was, they knew that these other safety things had happened in the past, and yet the science was really supporting that it was going to be safe. And at the time, there were not enough doses to go around to everybody that was available. And so public health departments and clinic offices had to make decisions about who they would give this to. And at that time, because this disease affected children primarily, as vaccine became available, they would give it primarily to children and then spread it after that. And I also wanted to show that, this wasn't just about the kids. This was about the parents that had to make the decision to have their kids get vaccinated, and, the courage that it took to enter into the unknown. And I think we're all kind of facing that as we think about this new vaccine process and what's that going to look like. And now, here we are about 6 weeks into it. We're gaining some experience, and so far I think it's going okay. But this is the benefit of vaccines when they work. Here's polio. You can see that all sorts of polio in the United States, and then the vaccine came on board, and we have had really no polio since then. So I'm not sure coronavirus will go exactly like this, but our hope is to really bend this curve down, just like we did with polio and other viral illnesses because of the effectiveness of vaccines. So, and here's measles too. I showed you how contagious that can be. Same thing with measles. We can really control the spread of that virus with vaccination. This is a picture of what happens in the immune system when somebody gets a virus. And this is an incredible oversimplification of what happens in your immune system when you get a virus. So I thought this was too complicated for me. So was this one here. So I decided to draw a super simplified version. And if there's any cell biologists or immunologists out there, I apologize for anything incorrect that I say here. But this is really what's happening when somebody gets a virus. Here's the virus. Here's your body's cell. The virus has a little connector that allows it, like a key and a lock, to get into the cell. So that's in coronavirus called the spike protein. So the virus goes, uses that key and lock mechanism to attach to the cell, and that allows it to go into the cell. Once it's inside the cell, it releases its genetic material and uses the body's machinery to make more of itself, reconstruct itself, and then get released out to go infect the next cell down the road. And this happens over the course of hours, and the numbers of viral particles we're talking about in these infections is in the order of trillions. There's just so many of them. So the goal with treatment is to slow this process down, and the goal of vaccination is try to stop this process, or have the immune system stop this process. We have a number of different vaccines that are in development. The two that are currently licensed that we're going to talk most about today are RNA vaccines. The reason that these are available first is because of the way they're made. They can be made very quickly. Basically, we just need the sequence of what the virus looks like or the protein looks like that we're trying to create. We can make that sequence in a lab using technology called PCR. And once you have the sequence, you make it and you basically cover it in a layer of fat so that it'll go into the cell and you're good to go. And you know, back on January 10th was when researchers in China shared the sequence for this protein with the rest of the world. I don't know about you, that I was only vaguely aware this thing even existed January 10th of last year, but already researchers were moving forward on vaccine development. So the downside is that this type of vaccine had not previously been used in humans for infection. But it has been used pretty extensively in research about cancer. They can try and use this type of vaccine to help fight cancer. So it's not like it was new. It's actually been around for 30 years being researched. But this is the first time it's been used for infectious vaccination. Other vaccines that you might be familiar with would be things like the influenza vaccine, which is a subunit vaccine where they use a bit of protein. That is just a bit of protein that mimics, that looks like the virus. So there's a few vaccines being adapted for coronavirus to be used there. And then there's another one where they basically attach a little bit of coronavirus with a different virus that is not a severe virus, to really mimic the immune response. And that's the AstraZeneca one that is currently being approved in Europe. So if we look at these in a little bit more detail, for example, the influenza vaccine, there's a couple of these for coronavirus that are being developed. They basically create a protein that looks like that little spike. There's nothing alive here, it's just the protein. But that comes in, and when it attaches to that receptor, it gets brought into the body, and then the body says, well, wait a minute, that protein shouldn't be there. And it starts this immune cascade so that next time it encounters that spike on the actual virus, it can immediately respond. You can also try what's called inactivated viruses that are killed in some way. So you get the virus material, it gets brought into the cell, but it's never going to actually grow because it's already dead. But that can start an immune cascade, although usually not quite as strong of an immune cascade because it's already dead. You can use a weakened virus that may not grow very well, that can cause an immune cascade. There's a number of vaccines that we already use that use this platform. The risk of that is that if it mutates back to being active, it can become active. This one takes longer to develop though, so we're not seeing that one in development. And then here are the ones that are actually available. The Pfizer and the Moderna one are both these mRNA vaccines. So when we talk about that, mRNA is this little molecule that is a little bit of genetic material that normally your body uses to communicate how to make new proteins. So they put that little sequence of the virus in there. This is not alive. It can't grow on its own. And they put it in a little fat layer, and then that attaches to the cell and gets brought in. And then your body looks at that and uses that to sequence a protein that actually is the spike protein. And then based on that spike protein makes an immune cascade that can fight against the actual virus when it comes. An important thing to note here is that this RNA never goes into what's called the nucleus of the cell. So this is where your genetic material lives, the DNA that makes you, you. So when I first heard about these vaccines, I thought, is that something where I'd worry about it changing my own DNA? And it turns out that mRNA does not have a way to get back into the nucleus. So these vaccines can't. They don't have a way to actually change your own DNA. These vaccines only live in the cell for a couple hours at the most before they fall apart. So this actually I view as kind of like a next generation type of vaccine that really mimics what a virus does without any of the risk of the virus itself, but can generate an immune cascade so that you're protected from this virus in the future. When we make vaccines, what we want to happen is for the vaccine to create enough of an immune response that it works, that it has a memory that your body's able to fight back against infections in the future. What we want to avoid is people getting too many side effects from those vaccines. What we really want to avoid is people getting severe reactions like anaphylaxis or other, allergic reactions, or even reactions where the immune system starts to cross-react with, other parts of the body. We also don't want no response. So we're really looking for this kind of perfect effect where we get a response that lasts, hopefully a long time, so that we're protected. In reality, with these vaccines, what I think we're seeing is something kind of like this. People are having some mild side effects, some fever, a little bit of body aches, but that then we're getting back into a place where the effect lasts, and hopefully lasts long enough that this isn't something we have to do all the time. So going forward, we have all sorts of vaccines in development. I think we're familiar with the two that are available. There's all sorts of things about distribution that we're going to talk about. Sometimes when you do vaccine trials, they don't work. Sometimes they take a lot longer and they move slowly, but the pipeline for vaccines is full right now. We have all sorts of things we're looking at, but we do have these two that are out and rolling. So one big question I think a lot of people have had is, how is it possible that polio took 50 years to figure out, and yet after 1 year we have this coronavirus vaccine? And I think there's been concern about, can we trust it if it was so quick, or is it reliable, all those things. And so I want to just talk through some context about why something like this can happen faster than usual and yet still be safe. So if we look at a few reasons, first off, this isn't our first coronavirus. There was SARS virus back in 2005. There was MERS virus in the Middle East back in 2012. And these were severe coronaviruses that, for reasons that I'm not entirely sure of, just kind of faded out on their own. They never really went anywhere. But they had developed some early vaccine work about those viruses already. These mRNA vaccines had already been extensively studied, as I said, for cancer. And then, unlike ever before, scientists across the world have been sharing information and data to try and speed this process up. The US federal government has gotten involved, and Moncef Slaoui is a former CEO of a vaccine company who was able to really help guide the process. And here you can see Dr. Anthony Fauci in the background, who is also very involved. So when vaccines get developed, there's sort of the scientific work that happens beforehand, the pre-work. Then, if it looks like there's something that might work, they start what's called a phase 1 trial. Phase 1 trial is basically to make sure it's safe and doesn't cause terrible reactions. They do this in young, healthy people that, if there was a reaction, would, generally be okay. As long as it goes okay, they try it in another phase and they make sure that it works in terms of its function. Does it create an antibody that we think will be protective? So this is a bigger group. And then finally, the phase 3 trials. These are big trials, thousands and thousands of people, where they try and see, does it actually work in reality? Does it prevent infections? Once you get to that point, if it gets approved, then it goes into production. So there's safety stops at each of these time periods where it gets reviewed to make sure that it is actually safe. And each of these phases takes a lot of setup. So, if you were a drug company getting ready to make one of these vaccines, you don't have a huge incentive to start the future phases unless this phase has already been approved, because if it doesn't work, then you've just lost, all your investment on the back end. So what Operation Warp Speed did was it injected a whole lot of money and expertise here, so that even though they were still doing the review at these steps, the companies could go forward with recruitment, setup, logistics, infrastructure, building this whole process so that the moment that the phase 1 was approved, they could immediately start phase 2, rather than all the delays you might associate with all the setup time it takes. So really, what that does is it flips this kind of linear process into a cascading, staggered process where you really don't move forward on the next phase until the last phase was approved, but you're already ready to rock in terms of the next study. And production has been ongoing from the beginning, which is one of the ways that we've been able to jumpstart the vaccination process. One of the reasons this helped was things we talked about, prior SARS data, mRNA studies, and then also just, coronaviruses in general. This has been moving very fast and it's very widespread. So that makes it a lot easier to study. If you give 10,000 people this vaccine, you really only have to wait a couple months before a certain number of them have gotten infected because coronavirus is so widespread. So the nature of this virus has helped us study it, even though it's been tragic in terms of outcomes for patients. Once phase 3 is approved, and once you have the product, then you can start going forward with distribution. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot about in the news right now. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of about that. First, let me just show you a little bit about the vaccine itself. So this is a graph of people that got basically a saltwater placebo shot. So they did not get the vaccine. And this is how much they were getting coronavirus over the course of about 3 months. These are people that got the coronavirus vaccine. And I'll remind you that these are a series of 2 shots, one at day 0 and one at day either 21 or 28. And you can see just from the graph how effective these vaccines are. Basically, by about day 10, after somebody's gotten their first shot, this line is pretty flat. There's just not a lot of new coronavirus coming out. Here's the second shot, in this area, and it stays flat. And basically, the math shows us that this is about a 95% decrease when compared to a saltwater shot. All the people in this study were, highly counseled to maintain physical distance and wear their masks and take good care. And these infections happened despite all of that. And, you can see that there were just a few infections that happened despite the vaccine. And that's always true of vaccines. A lot of our best vaccines are 70% effective. And if we would have heard 70% on this one, I think we would have been happy. But 95% is really a phenomenal response and becomes a very powerful tool in our ability to fight against this infection. How long it'll last is a question I think that's lingering out there, but you can see that this lasted at least out to 3 months, and we've actually got more data now suggesting that it continues to last. So if we, and this is the AstraZeneca data. So this is a different type of vaccine. This is the one where they use the other type of virus and attach a little bit of coronavirus to it. This also looks like it's pretty effective, about 70% effective. There's some details to the data where when they actually gave a low dose and then a high dose, I guess they call it a standard dose, a low dose and then a standard dose of the vaccine, it seemed like it was even almost up to 90% effective. So I think the company's trying to figure those details out. This has now been approved in Europe, and I think will be approved in the United States before too long. And I think we'll also extend our ability to offer vaccination to people. It's not actually approved yet, though, so we'll learn more once the FDA reviews that data and I imagine approves it. So if we look at just the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, this is how they listed their side effects in their trial. It's too complicated to read. This is a much easier way to look at it. So people that felt just kind of body aches, fatigue, headache, chills, fever, and upset stomach. These were on the order of, 40% with headache, 40% with fatigue. But these are the people that got the saltwater shot, and you can see that they had 30% of the same things. I think that's probably because they wanted to actually have gotten the vaccine and were hoping to have side effects, because people in the studies don't know what they got, A lot of people are reporting pain in their arm. And I would say this isn't any worse than a tetanus shot if you've had a tetanus vaccine before. My own experience I can share is that the day after the first one, I had some arm pain. The next day I felt a little tired, but that was it. After my second one, I had the same thing, some arm pain. And the following morning, I felt a little nauseated, and I was generally just fatigued that day. If I would have had to have gone to work, I could have. Fortunately, it was the weekend, so I just laid low, and by the following day, I felt totally fine. And I think that's been reflected in our, employees here at the clinic and hospital that have gotten this vaccine. That seems to be the general story, that the first one goes okay, the second one, people have some mild kind of systemic feeling yucky symptoms, and then by the next day they're fine. I've also heard from people that actually already had COVID infection that when they get their vaccine, even the first one, they have more side effects, kind of like what I had with my second one. Again, fairly mild, but something to be aware of if you've already had COVID. We haven't had any severe reactions to speak of within our community here. If you look at the big studies of 40 to 60,000 people that were done by the companies, there really were no severe reactions. Now that we're vaccinating millions of people, I think we're up to 19 million people in the US. There have been a few reports of allergic responses, which you would kind of expect with almost any treatment you try, that a very small portion of people could potentially have an allergy. And that's true of penicillin, that's true of ibuprofen, that's true of everything. But fortunately, it seems like it's still in the realm of very, very rare. And if we think about the true risk of a vaccine, these are incredibly safe when we compare it even to just risk of day-to-day living. So I would say side effects were maybe somewhat worse than a flu shot. I don't know if you've had side effects with your flu shots in the past, but just again, kind of general yucky feeling that was gone by the next day. Absolute contraindications to getting this vaccine are if you know you're allergic to any of these things. Basically, it's the virus RNA, and then some salt type stuff. I'm not aware of anybody that knows they're allergic to these specific things. It's really not a very complicated list of ingredients. So, but they do say if you know you're allergic to sucrose, then you probably shouldn't take this. And if you've had COVID before, you can still get these vaccines. If you have been treated with antibodies, either the plasma or the lab-made antibodies, we recommend you wait 90 days to allow those antibodies to get out of your system so that your body actually makes an immune response. There was a few allergies early on in the UK that gave us pause, but I think time has shown now that with millions of people getting vaccinated, that's hopefully been rare. There have been a lot of questions about pregnancy and breastfeeding. No, there were no pregnant or breastfeeding women in any of these big studies of 60,000 people. So different countries have taken different approaches. The UK said that no, those people shouldn't be vaccinated. In the United States, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology actually lobbied that women be allowed to make the choice themselves if they think their risk is high enough that they would still be vaccinated anyway. And so what the US has done is basically said if women make that choice, they could choose to be vaccinated despite being pregnant or breastfeeding. And I would share that women that are pregnant are at a higher risk than the general public of getting very sick from actual COVID infection. So my own take on this is, as far as breastfeeding goes, I can't imagine how this vaccine could in any way put baby at risk for breastfeeding. So I feel very comfortable recommending it to breastfeeding mothers, and I recommended it to my own wife. When it comes to pregnancy, I think having a little bit more hesitancy about that is reasonable. I think a woman that has a heavy or regular COVID-19 risk, for example, a nurse taking care of COVID patients, may want to consider getting this vaccine because, again, I can't really think of a mechanism about how this would be risky. It's just that it hasn't been studied until now because many pregnant women are actually getting the vaccine. And so there's a registry keeping track. And I think we'll know within a few months, if this is truly safe or not. I think we'll find out that it is. It doesn't carry any extra risk. There's sort of a rumor out there that this vaccine could cause infertility because of a very small, like 1% similarity between the virus protein and placenta protein. That's obviously not been shown to be true because coronavirus hasn't been around that long. But when we look at things like prior coronavirus infections, people that actually got that infection didn't end up having higher rates of infertility. And cell biologists, when they look at this theory, have deemed it vanishingly unlikely. Like a true scientist, they'll never tell you 100% that something can't happen unless it's been studied. But I just think the risk of this is so unlikely that I would happily give this to my 12-year-old daughter once it becomes available. There's also been concern from folks about the use of fetal stem cells. Some of the research on mRNA vaccines years and years ago did use fetal stem cells back then. The current vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna don't use fetal stem cells currently in production. The AstraZeneca vaccine may use some of those stem cells in production. And so I think different groups that have concerns about the use of fetal stem cells are weighing in on this. And, I go to St. Thomas, and as a Catholic, the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops has encouraged to say that the use of these two vaccines we shouldn't hesitate about that from a moral concern standpoint. And that's, up to each individual to think through, but it's important to know this background. So here we have, the whole process. It's moved fast. We're happy that they've done all the safety reviews on the Pfizer Moderna, and I agree that it looks like it's all been done well and vaccine is safe. And here we are at distribution. And so within the distribution plan, once we get out to sending it to the states, then kind of the companies and the Operation Warp Speed wash their hands of it and say it's up to you. I view that a little bit as kind of kicking the can down the road, as not wanting to take responsibility about deciding who can get it and when. But basically the federal government is sending it out to the states, and then the states are each setting their own standards for who is a candidate to get these vaccines when they're in such limited supply. So what the state of Iowa has done is said phase 1A would be healthcare providers who are actively taking care of folks with COVID-19, and then also people living in long-term care facilities like nursing homes. So we're almost there. Actually, we're about here on this curve, and so I heard our data today, we're about 80% complete with just 20% left to do. So you may have heard in the news that we're about to start phase 1B on February 1st. And so, this who is in this category has actually changed quite a bit over the past few weeks, including just last week when they changed it from anybody 75 and up to anybody 65 and up. So anybody 65 and up is eligible just based on their age. And then pre-K through 12 school teachers, first responders, people that work in agriculture and distribution, people that live in congregate settings like group homes, people that have to go into these settings to make sure they're safe, and then people that are living in a different type of congregate setting like a prison, because they've shown to have much higher risk to get coronavirus there as well. And basically what they've said is 50% of the vaccine available to Iowans will go to people based on their age, and 50% will go to people based on their kind of work or living criteria down here. So, then it kind of gets sent out to the county public health to decide how they will operationalize that process. And what we are working on here in Story County is that the healthcare providers like McFarland Clinic will be taking on the age-related vaccination, and the public health department, Story County Public Health, will be taking on the sort of work-related or congregational living-related vaccination process. So because of that, we've had to sort of think through how are we going to use a limited number of vaccines for this population of people. We're getting several hundred vaccines per week, and there are several thousand people in this group. And so that's where this data comes in. This is from the Iowa Department of Public Health. And if you look at the 4,500 people in Iowa who have died, 60% of them were 80 years or older, 21% were 70 or older, 12% were 60 and older, and on down the line. So because of that, and from my standpoint, because the goal of the vaccination first and foremost is to prevent death, what we're planning to do is go based on age. So here's an age pyramid, and you can see here that a very small proportion of people are 100 years old. So basically our plan is to call them, offer them the vaccine if we have it available. If they're interested, we schedule them and move forward and give them the vaccine. And then we'll just move down this pyramid as we get, eventually down to this 65 and up mark. Here's the Iowa population pyramid. So I calculated this out. It's about 15% total is over 65. And then here's the McFarland Clinic network. And remember, McFarland Clinic goes beyond Story County. It's Marshall County and Carroll and Jefferson and kind of all of central Iowa. But you can see the numbers down to age 65 here. Basically we're talking about something like 20 to 25,000 people. So the limitation here is really going to be the amount of vaccine that we get. But our plan is to start at the top of the pyramid and work our way down. And then if people call in and say, I'm interested, and let's say they are, 76, basically they'll know that, okay, yes, you're in line, you're 76, we have this cascade, and we can kind of give you a rough estimate based on our current vaccine being delivered that it'll be this many weeks until we have your vaccine available. There's some details within this that are being hammered out. I think it'd be nice to be able to do households, so if there's one person that's 88 and one person that's 80, it'd be nice to do them together just for logistical and practicality purposes. And I think we'll be able to work that out, but I haven't heard back from administrative people if we think we can swing that or not. What we don't know is how long it'll last for sure. This is some data of even people over 70, and it looks like the immune response really didn't drop off even at 3 months. So my hope is that the immune response just continues on potentially for several years. And it looks like the amount of antibody generated after the vaccine is actually higher than the amount of antibody after you've actually had COVID. So even people that have had COVID, I still think it's important to get the vaccine in hopes of preventing reinfection. You may have heard about different, what are called variants, different types of the virus that are coming out. Those are random mutations that occur that lead the virus to change. And as of now, Moderna has done some studies that were reported just today that their vaccine is still effective against the current variants. It does remain possible that a variant could come out that in some way bypasses the benefit of these vaccines. I would say in general, though, the way viruses mutate, in order to bypass a vaccine, they often would have to make a trade-off. And the trade-off usually leads them to grow less slowly or be less effective viruses, and so they end up making people less sick. So there has already been talk about, if a variant comes out, could these companies tweak their vaccine and give a booster out, that sort of thing. I think that all remains to be seen, but is very possible. I'm not seeing much about very rare side effects, and so far I haven't seen much for better vaccines, although there might be some benefit if it's something that's only one shot instead of two, so you don't have to worry about the logistics of that second shot. So far what we have seems like it's effective and safe, though. The CDC has set up a nice monitoring system for anybody that gets the vaccines to monitor for side effects, so we get a lot of data. And then there are certain countries that have nationalized healthcare systems like Israel that basically are giving the vaccine and have opened up their data doors to the drug company to look at in detail what happened across the entire population, which I think we'll learn a lot from that. So how long will the people in the studies kind of be stuck not getting the actual vaccine? It's a good question, because at some point they should be offered protection, although the longer they go, the more we learn about that vaccine. So I imagine we're kind of getting to the point now where those people should be vaccinated, but I'm not sure how long that'll work. I think there's interesting questions too about, the sharing of vaccines between different countries, especially with the wealth gap between different countries. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that we all do better when we all do better, and the more vaccine we can get out worldwide, the better we'll all be off. I did get the vaccine, as I mentioned. I do recommend it to my parents and my family once they have the opportunity. I would not recommend traveling across the country to try and find this vaccine. I wouldn't recommend fighting about it with anybody. When we talk about this cascade of age it's not that you won't get the vaccine if you're, 66. It just means that in that category, you may have to wait a couple more weeks compared to everybody else. And we had the same discussion within our own clinic as the first vaccines became available, and we did the same thing. We prioritized based on risk. There will be people that maybe don't want to get the vaccine at first. And I think it's about 15 to 20% of our employees didn't feel that it was the right thing for them. And, I would say, let's not argue about this. There's a lot of arguing that happens in the world, and we don't need to fight about this one. We don't have enough vaccine for everybody right now anyway. So let's just focus on letting people get their questions answered as they have them, and keeping the door open. If as they learn more about the vaccine or see other people get it and it goes okay, maybe they change their minds. But again, I don't think we should spend any energy, fighting with people that maybe don't want to get the vaccine. That we can get to that later. How long will this pandemic last, especially with the vaccines? And, it depends on how many people get vaccinated in the end. It depends on how quickly the companies can make the vaccine. I'd love to see them pick up the pace. At the end of the day, these vaccines are real things that they have to make, though. So you can't just pull them out of thin air. It depends on what we all do after we get the vaccine, or if we haven't had it yet, can we help slow the virus down? And then it depends on these unknown things like mutations and how long the vaccines will last. But what I'd love to do is see this curve, our curve of, infections going up and then back down again, kind of get flipped around the other way, where we come down off the back end of our November surge, and then we just kind of drift down into almost nothing over time. We may have some blips, based on different populations being at risk, but as more and more of the high risk people get vaccinated, the hope would be that we wouldn't see the corresponding increase in death rates that follows a blip. And if the vaccine functions to turn this virus into just a common cold that we can all live with, well, I'd be happy for that. You may have seen this Swiss cheese model of virus prevention. There's all these different things we can do, wearing masks and washing our hands and physical distancing and good filtration and airflow. And then this last one is the vaccines. And, this last slice, there's really not many holes in this. The vaccine is very effective once we can get it out to everybody. So my hope would be, as we start to see the curve come down and there being very few infections in the community, that, then we can say, well, maybe it's starting to be safe to do certain activities again that we've been avoiding. And then we do those things and we see, does the numbers all of a sudden go up or not? And we take it in the stepwise process of, kind of undoing everything that's been done. So at the end of the day, I would recommend getting this vaccine once it's available. I think it'll be effective and safe. I would say even once you've gotten the vaccine, continuing these good practices makes sense, especially until we see numbers going way down. I could say personally that if you're thinking about what does this mean in terms of day-to-day, what's the benefit of getting vaccinated? I do think that if you're around somebody else that's been vaccinated, the chance of that person giving you COVID or vice versa is very low just based on the math. We know that if we tested 100 Iowans today, just who felt fine, we'd find that 1% of them actually have COVID in their nose and just didn't know it. But if, they've been vaccinated and you've been vaccinated, these 95% numbers start to make a 1 in 40,000 risk, which is very low. That's something I think that we can start to live with. If you lived in LA right now where the virus is going bonkers and 1 in 10 people, if you test them, happen to test positive, that number is maybe a little bit less reliable. Also, if you're in Iowa and maybe your immune system works just fine, but maybe your parents' immune system is really weak and it's not clear how well the vaccine might produce an antibody, then you're looking at maybe slightly higher risk in general. But I would say in general, if 2 people have been vaccinated and the numbers are better overall, I start to feel a lot better about that. I would say personally, an anecdote is that we had twins 6-7 months ago, and a lot of our family hasn't met the twins, and we'd really love them to. So my wife's sister was vaccinated as part of her work as an occupational therapist. And we were hoping to have her come visit us next weekend and meet these babies. But then at work, she had a defined COVID exposure. She had a patient that had COVID and nobody knew it, and she spent a long time in the home with this patient. And so we decided, yes, we've got our good double vaccination process, the risk is low, but if we've had a known exposure, it doesn't make sense to throw caution to the wind. And so we're just going to delay that visit, a week or two. So that's what I mean by keep using common sense, even once you've had the vaccine. I would say, especially in the midst of a pandemic, it's not an excuse to be cavalier. So with that, I think let's open it up to questions or discussion or whatever would be most useful for you all. And I thank you so much for being here and your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fulton. You have provided a fact-based informational look at this that I know that I have never been a part of. And so I certainly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come and share this with our club. There are several questions that I can get through here in the chat. I was just wanting to check and be respectful of your time, Dr. Fulton. Do you have a few minutes to continue with some questions?
I sure do. Yeah, I'm rounding in the hospital today, which is pretty flexible. So as I have time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to go through some of these, and maybe you did answer some as you continued to talk, but I think one was around the availability of Ames getting supply for those in Category 1B, and I think you kind of addressed that February 1st, right, is when we hopefully will begin that process. Yeah,
although I would add that that's, we're really restricted by the state here, what we're kind of allowed to do, and the state sets the rules about who we can vaccinate, but that doesn't increase the amount of vaccine we're getting. What we're seeing right now is that we're getting a couple hundred doses per week. So, if you think about that whole population of people over 65, whatever strategy you end up taking, there's just not enough vaccine for the whole 1B group yet. My hope is that the companies are obviously ramping up production as fast as they can. And I hope that we'll see a likewise increase in the amount of vaccine that we're getting, so that then we can, then keep pushing that out to the public. A couple of challenges are, there's different strategies across different states. And so, for example, some states have said, anybody over 65, it's available, just sign up. But that's created, extensive lines, website crashes, a lot of uncertainty about how to get it. And it seems more like it's just based on luck rather than, a stratification of risk. And frankly, it's created a lot of chaos in those places. And our goal was to try to avoid that. There's no system that we can create that doesn't have, the chance of, I think, having specific circumstances that don't seem like they make sense. For example, a 64-year-old person who has, cancer and is on chemotherapy, their risk is high and probably higher than a totally healthy 65-year-old person who has no other health problems. But at the end of the day, we're stuck with what the state has provided us with rules. And, when it comes to supply, we just got to use what we have. I do think it's important that we think about this vaccination process. If we could all just take a real community view of this and think about it from the standpoint of every single person that gets vaccinated is a success for all of us. One more person vaccinated is one less person that can get COVID and pass it on to somebody else. And so when I hear of somebody getting vaccinated, it just feels like another opportunity to celebrate, even if it's not my parents, because those people can't give it to my parents. And eventually, my parents will get it. It's just a question of, being patient, and people have been so patient for the last year and we're all tired of it. But if we can just hold out another 1 to 2 months, I think it won't be long before we really are able to move through that whole 1B group. I think another issue that people have heard about is because there's 2 shots, what if we just gave everybody 1 shot and saw if it worked? And I'd be cautious about that because, that graph that shows a flat line after you've been vaccinated, we don't know if that flat line would persist if you don't get the second shot. Maybe it starts to go back up again. I view the second shot as being what generates memory and allows your immune system to remember this thing into the future. So, different states have taken different approaches. Just get all the vaccine out, get everybody one, and then as we get the second one, you try and give it out as it comes in. But that creates logistical challenges. What if the person doesn't follow up and get it? What if we wait too long after the first shot? Now we're 2 months out. Will it still work? We don't know for sure. We think so. Or you take a more guarded approach where you make sure you save enough of your vaccine to give that second dose once those first rounders come through for their second dose, but then it kind of looks like you're sitting on vaccine and not giving it out. So I think these are logistical challenges, but I think the closer we can stick to the way these things were studied, the more success we'll have in showing that they work and building trust in the community for those people that are maybe on the fence.
Yeah, I think it's refreshing as your outlook, and we can all, as Rotarians, and our pledge to live by our four-way test, to cheer when anyone gets a vaccine is a great perspective. So thank you for that. And I also wrote down your quote, let's not fight about this. And that was regards to, the vaccination as well, whether someone chooses to take it or not. So thank you for your positive words as well. I'm just going to run through a couple of these other questions. Feel free to be brief if you need to. And one question, a dose. A dose, is that a person or a number of persons? Is it just one for one?
When we talk about number of doses, you might hear from like the company Pfizer's making 5 million doses per week. So it takes 2 doses to vaccinate one person. So if you think about Pfizer making 5 million doses per week, that's enough to vaccinate 2.5 million people. So that affects, the total numbers. When you hear that the United States has purchased 200 million doses, that's enough for 100 million people. So that's not enough for everybody. But the presumption is as the company makes more become available and we can buy more.
Do we know if there's a need for annual booster vaccines in the future? We're just not sure yet, and how long that's going to be effective.
We don't know that yet. Based on some of that early data, it does look like the vaccine generated antibody lasts at the same level even 3 to 6 months out from when these studies were started. I think the reason for follow-up vaccinations may be more related to these variants as they come out. There's been some discussion about a South African variant that these vaccines may not be as effective for, and then that's where the companies may, tweak the sequence just so that it continues to be effective for those, and then, maybe give an update down the road. Some of this might be pretty targeted, like, we know that in London they've got their particular variant, and if we, maybe those are folks that would get an update shot next year if they're having a little outbreak, but maybe not everybody if it's not widespread. So I do think that remains to be seen. I'm hopeful to not have to get, another vaccine every year, but frankly, if that's what it came to, I would do it.
Thank you. And as far as the material, the supply, is it raw materials that go into the vaccine that might be constraining the supply, or is it just production capacity of the vaccine facilities? And then related to that, is the Pfizer vaccine's refrigeration requirement because of the fat molecule?
Yes, great questions. My impression is that it has to do with not the raw materials, but the production itself. These are big old machines that are used to sequence the little genetic material. And then they talk about the use of nanotechnology. Basically, they then have to particleize all these little bits of RNA into that kind of fat bubble that is able to move into the human cell with greater ease and then generate that immune response. So this type of technology, it is that fat bubble that requires the deep freeze. Otherwise, it would just, like a bubble, it would just kind of fall apart. And, there are logistical challenges with the deep freeze, but I do think that states are being thoughtful with, sending primarily the Pfizer vaccine towards big facilities that have freezer capacity, and then sending Moderna more to, more rural places. So I think in rural Iowa, we'll probably see more of the Moderna vaccine because of that issue. I mean, we have deep freezer capacity, but I think from a strategic standpoint, the state is looking at all of that. I would add that there is this rumor or false theory out there about the vaccine injecting a computer chip into people, and I think the genesis of that has to do with the word nanotechnology, and people hear that and think, oh gosh, is this a computer chip or whatever? And I really think we just need to clarify, when we talk about nanotechnology, it's just getting that little super microscopic bit of genetic material into the fat bubble. That's what the nanotechnology is, and that just requires machines and time, and they need to basically have more machines to scale up capacity. And I think, invoking the War Powers Act, the federal government may be able to speed that process up to some degree, but this is a delicate thing with a high degree of quality control to make sure they're safe. So it's hard to scale it up really fast.
With the global vaccine development, you mentioned the stages of approval or U.S. stages of approval. How's the vaccine development going on a global scene?
That's a great question. Different. I guess I would say power centers are doing their own kind of vaccine process. So China has a couple different type of vaccines that they're working on. Russia has a vaccine that they're working on. And then, they work with their partners. So the United States and Europe have primarily been working together in terms of development. And then it's just interesting to see different regulatory things. It took the EU a little bit longer to approve, certain vaccines than it took London or the United States, but now the EU has already approved the AstraZeneca, whereas the US hasn't. And that kind of just gets down into the nitty gritty of the regulatory process and how it kind of plays out in each country. I would say that I feel confident in the quality review of what we're seeing in our vaccines here. I would not feel particularly confident potentially in some of the other vaccines that are coming out nationwide or internationally, because the data just hasn't been shared. That doesn't mean they don't work or they're not safe, but until I actually see data on these things, I have a hard time saying they're safe. And especially, you hear about a vaccine coming out of Russia that's 99.99% effective, and it just makes me worry about, how reliable is that data until it's shared. It makes me happy we have a robust regulatory process, even though that regulatory process can potentially slow us down. At least we can feel confident in what we're getting.
Thank you. And then once all the residents of a care facility get vaccinated, why wouldn't the facility be able to open up so that family members could come to see the residents and their loved ones?
That's a great question. Two thoughts. One thing before I forget about that, when I showed you that graph of like the age population within our network here, many of those people are in nursing facilities. And so if they've already gotten their vaccine, then, basically their box gets checked and we just move down to the next person on the line. So even though there was a lot of numbers in the 65 and up, remember that we've already vaccinated thousands and thousands of people in care facilities who are in that age category. So that does change that curve a little bit. Our goal is to be risk averse when it comes to infection prevention. We have to do this within the hospital and the clinic setting also. We also have to acknowledge the downside of not having visitors. And I think that's true both within the hospital and within nursing facilities. So I think what we'll see in the coming probably months is a reframing of infection prevention practices in nursing facilities where, if people have had the vaccine, those visitor policies might loosen up. But I would bet that the companies that run those sites are going to be pretty risk averse at first and want to see the numbers come down. There may be people in those facilities that chose not to get that vaccine. If a person coming to visit hasn't been vaccinated, there's that potential risk of walking COVID in the front door of your congregate living setting. So I think that's coming. I think we'll get there. We're talking already about our visitor policies within Mary Greeley in terms of, you know, we don't generally have a lot of visitors for people that have COVID because we don't want family to get infected also. But if a family member's been vaccinated, we're hoping to start to allow more visitors because it is so important. So I don't have a specific answer for that other than we're pretty risk averse about wanting to avoid exposure to people. But as more people are vaccinated, I think that risk goes down and then we will start to see things open up.
And I think you kind of addressed this next question about immune compromised people who might fall under age 65-year-old categories. How are they identified, and can their doctor put them on a vaccine list, as a priority?
That's a great question. So initially they were saying, the state was saying that phase 1B would be 75 and up, plus the school teachers and stuff. I think because of a general movement by the federal government to encourage 65 and up, they changed that number. Originally, it was going to be phase 1C, was going to be 65 and up, or people that had qualifying health conditions like a weak immune system or something. So for now, they did in phase 1B decrease that age limit to 65. They did not include diagnosis specific concerns like weak immune system on chemotherapy or anything like that. So my impression is that those folks will still be in category 1C, phase 1C, which would be the next phase after the current phase, but before the general population. So there aren't strings to pull. There's not a specialized list for people that are, say, 63 and have a weak immune system. And it gets back to kind of that notion that there will be pitfalls to any approach. I think it just involves, everything I need to learn, I learned in kindergarten, and there's just only one green crayon and we got to share it. And the way the state has defined that is they've given us who we can vaccinate. And as soon as we're done with that group, we move on to the next one. And that's, I think, where people with immune conditions will start to have access.
Thank you. And then a comment from one of our members, Dan Devine, says his sister lives in Charleston, South Carolina. She was in the AZN study. She's expected to find out if she got the vaccine or placebo about a month after the end of the study, and if placebo, then gets the vaccine. So sister is involved in one of those studies.
I think it's
what about
the heroic efforts of people that were willing to step up and be in these studies, because we're talking about tens of thousands of Americans getting something shot in their arm that nobody'd ever used before. And I just think that they are an unspoken group of heroes here that took something on for the good of everybody. And I applaud your sister, because we wouldn't be where we were today without them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dan, pass that on to your sister. We're all proud of her. So that was awesome. Newest outlook for vaccine trials for children. Is there updates or anything on that front?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the original studies of at least these two vaccines that are approved were in 18 and up. The FDA approved the Pfizer vaccine for 16 and up, just based on human biology. After you're 16, you're close enough to 18. You actually look on the FDA vote, they voted 17-3, I think. The three people that voted against approving the Pfizer vaccine did it because of that 16-year-old designation. They said if it would have been 18 years and up based on the study, they would have voted yes. So that's just an interesting detail. All of these companies are, now that they've gotten it approved, they're already engaging in studies down to age 12 as kind of the next step. And I think if we look at the data about pediatric kid infections can happen, and obviously any bad outcome is terrible. If we look at the number of kids that have bad outcomes, it is much lower than the likelihood of a kid getting in a car accident or having something happen at home. I mean, kids, fortunately, thanks be to God, they are not seemingly having bad outcomes with this virus. So it makes sense to me that they would, in some sense, be at the end of the line for vaccination. What remains to be seen, though, is could they potentially be vectors for transmission into the future? And so I do think we'll see studies looking at them in terms of safety and does it work to prevent infection in kids? And eventually, I imagine that kids will be vaccinated. But again, I don't think that would be until late summer. I saw an interesting talk by a pediatric infectious disease physician from the University of Iowa last week, and basically there are studies that show, as long as if kids are in school where masks are required, their risk of getting COVID is actually lower than if they weren't in school. So the risk of schools isn't for kids, it's for teachers. So anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. I think those studies are coming for kiddos. That becomes relevant when you want to take kids to see grandparents and stuff. So I think, if we can vaccinate grandparents to get them all safe and protected, decrease the numbers in the community, and eventually I think the kids' vaccines will catch up, but it'll be months.
Okay, there was a lot of softball questions there, but here comes a big one. You ready? This is, I'm sure, one you hear all the time.
Yeah.
Can you give a summary of the efficacy of masks in preventing the spread of disease? So thoughts on mask deniers and mask mandates and the efficacy of double masks. I appreciate your perspective to all of this being so positive. But you have some thoughts on the masks?
Yeah, masks work, period. I think if we look at masks, I think we need to look at the bigger picture of what are we really trying to do? We're trying to prevent a viral particle from moving from one person's nose into another person's lungs. And so, having a barrier up between your nose and that person's lungs is useful. Having two barriers up, over your mouth and nose and over their mouth and nose is more useful. Having 4 barriers, 2 masks versus 1, I think you could probably measure there are fewer viral particles that happen in that instance. But then you start to get into the realm of the absurd, why not wear 20 masks? So at some point you need to do something that's functional and makes sense. I think about this kind of the way I think about glitter. When we talk about infections and viral particles, we're talking about billions of particles. The goal is not no glitter, because there's no situation in which, you play with glitter and you don't get any glitter on you. But the goal is to decrease the amount of glitter or viral particles enough that they don't generate infection, or if they do, the infection is not as severe. So I think there's good data to suggest that masks can decrease the likelihood of an infection. I said decrease, I didn't say prevent. So they decrease the likelihood, but they don't make it perfect. And that they can decrease the severity of the infection if you get it. So how would that work? Well, if you get fewer viral particles, you're less likely to get as sick. So along those lines, I recommend masks to people. I think, the one thing I can say is that there have been a few studies that suggest the kind of the really stretchy neck gaiter material that can get pulled up over your nose and mouth and is really stretchy. There's some studies that show that may actually, with breathing, kind of make it more linear and make it shoot out farther. So those types of masks, I think we should be recommending against those. But other standard masks, whether they're, like the medical grade ones that are made of microfiber paper, or even, the homemade ones that we make, the way I think about this is if you can kind of hold it up to the light, if you don't see a ton of light coming through it, it's probably a thick enough material that it'll capture those viral particles. I think people that have concerns about masks, what I've seen is data quoted from some, I guess what I would call small studies that the outcome was different than what the grand majority of other studies have concluded. And so we have to weigh those against each other. There have been a few studies that their setup was a little bit unique and people were living together for longer periods of time. And they said, well, maybe the masks didn't help in that setting. And I guess I tend to agree. If you live with somebody, wearing a mask in the house probably isn't going to make that much difference. But I do think in general, I would recommend masks. I recommend them to my family. I always wear one when I'm indoors anywhere. I think the utility of masks outside, if you are going on a walk, going on a run, not packed in with, hundreds of people like at an outdoor concert or something, but kind of spread out. I don't know that masks add a lot in that setting. Just has to do with just airflow dynamics. You breathe out and the particles are just gone. There's not enough of them to cause an infection. So masks indoors, yes. Higher quality ones, yes, that's good. But if, homemade masks, I think are good too. And can I give you numbers in terms of specific risk reduction? I've seen numbers ranging from 40 to 60% in terms of risk reduction. But all of these studies are very observational. It's really hard to randomize a study like this to really look at it. Of course, there's never been a randomized trial of parachutes either. Parachutes work, and we don't need to study that to know that. So anyway, I'm kind of talking in circles here, but I do think they work. And
Thank you. Yep. One more question. We'll wrap it up here. So I understand this is a question that you can take 5 draws of vaccine from one vial, like yellow fever. Do you need to arrange 5 people as a vaccination group to use the vaccine efficiently? Can you get in for a vaccine quickly if there's a no-show?
Yes. So we will have a process of kind of I'm not entirely sure what this will look like, but yeah. So what we found is with the vials, they're designed to be 6-dose vials, but every once in a while, as you're drawing it up through the needle, you get to that 5th dose, and it seems like there's enough left over to do a 6th dose, but maybe you've only scheduled 5 people for their vaccines. So then, how do we get that extra dose used? I think we'll have a list of people that we know can get in quickly to get their vaccine. Again, still on that triangle would be our goal, but yeah, we've seen some stories about freezers going out or needing to use 200 vaccines as soon as possible. Just bring in anybody that you can bring in, and in general, yeah, we want vaccines to go to the highest risk people. If push comes to shove, I'd rather not waste a vaccine, and I'd give it to anybody if they wanted it, and we could move forward. So I think we'll have some sort of a process for that. Again, any vaccine to anyone is a success for everyone.
Awesome. Dr. Fulton, the comments in the chat have been so favorable. We're just fortunate, as Sarah Buck said, to have you in our community, and thank you for taking time for such a thorough presentation today. Others are excellent program. I can't say enough. I can't imagine how busy you've been over the past year, and absolutely deserve some applause from us as members of your community. You have our trust, and we thank you for what you do to keep us all safe and help study this. And you've done a great job of presenting it in even a way that I can understand it. So we certainly appreciate the way that you communicate as well. So thank you for fighting the good fight, Dr. Fulton. We appreciate you, and go out and do some more good this afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate being here. Bye.
Thank you. And for the club, thanks for staying late. We lost, about 30 people who probably had some other commitment, but we are still 57 strong, about 90 minutes into this meeting. So that just is a testament to the quality of the program. Thank you, Louis. I think you put that together and arranged that if you're still on here. Thank you for doing that, and the program committee. And with that, we'll get you on your way. We'll wrap up here with the 4-way test. What a great program. Of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.